The frozen mud crunched beneath General George Washington's boots as he stood on the banks of the Delaware River, staring across the ice-choked waters at the enemy-occupied shores of New Jersey. It was December 26, 1776, and the Continental Army had just achieved the impossible stunning victory at Trenton. That breathed life back into a dying revolution, but Washington knew that one victory, however dramatic, would not be enough to sustain the fragile momentum they had gained. The British and Hessian forces were already regrouping, and Lord Cornwallis himself was marching south from New York with a formidable army of 8,000 men. The general understood that the next few days would determine whether the American cause would survive the winter or perish in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The Continental Army that huddled around their campfires that December evening bore little resemblance to a professional military force. Many soldiers lacked proper shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they marched. Their uniforms were a patchwork of civilian clothes and military remnants, and their weapons ranged from modern muskets to ancient fowling pieces. Yet these men had just proven that they could defeat professional European soldiers, and Washington sensed that their confidence was beginning to return. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as an artillery officer despite his youth, moved among the cannon crews with characteristic intensity. The young West Indian had distinguished himself during the retreat from New York, and his battery had played a crucial role in the Trenton victory. As he checked the condition of his guns and counted his remaining shot, Hamilton could feel that something fundamental had changed in the Army's spirit. According to historical accounts preserved in the National Archives, Washington spent that evening in deep consultation with his most trusted officers. The intelligence reports they received painted a dire picture. Cornwallis was approaching with overwhelming force, and the British were determined to crush this unexpected American resurgence. Before it could spread, the general faced an agonizing decision: retreat across the Delaware to safety, or stay and fight against impossible odds. The soldiers themselves seemed to sense the gravity of their situation. Many of their enlistments would expire at midnight on December 3rd or 1st, just 5 days away. If they chose to go home, as they had every legal right to do, the Army would simply dissolve. The revolution would end not with a dramatic defeat, but with a quiet exodus of farmers and tradesmen returning to their families. Yet there was something different in the air that night. The victory at Trenton had reminded these men that they were not just fighting for abstract principles of liberty and self-governance. They were fighting for their right to exist as free people. The Hessian prisoners they had captured were professional soldiers, yet they had been defeated by American volunteers who believed in their cause. As Washington walked among his men that evening, he could see the change in their faces. The despair that had marked their retreat across New Jersey had been replaced by something harder to define, not quite confidence, but a grim determination to see this fight through to its conclusion. The general knew that he was witnessing a transformation that would echo through history. Dawn on December 27th brought disturbing news to the American camp. British patrols had been spotted moving south along multiple roads, and local intelligence confirmed that Lord Cornwallis had taken personal command of the pursuit. The Earl was reportedly furious about the Hessian defeat at Trenton and had canceled his planned voyage to England to personally oversee the destruction of Washington's army. Washington called an immediate council of war with his senior officers. General Nathanael Greene, the Rhode Islander who had proven himself one of the Army's most capable commanders, argued for an immediate retreat across the Delaware. The river crossing had saved them before, and it could do so again. But Washington had been studying his maps throughout the night, and he had conceived a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, perhaps both. The general proposed something unprecedented. Instead of retreating, they would advance deeper into New Jersey and strike at Princeton, where a significant British garrison was stationed. The move would be strategically sound, as Princeton controlled crucial supply lines and served as a major depot for British operations in central New Jersey. More importantly, it would demonstrate that the Americans were capable of sustained offensive operations, not just desperate raids. Colonel John Cadwalader, who commanded the Pennsylvania militia, expressed the concerns that many officers felt but were reluctant to voice. Their army was exhausted from the Trenton operation, short on ammunition, and facing an enemy force that outnumbered them by nearly 4-1. Any military academy would teach that such a move bordered on madness, but Washington had learned to think beyond conventional military wisdom. He understood that this war would not be won through traditional European tactics, but through bold strokes. That captured the imagination of the American people and convinced foreign powers that the colonies could actually achieve independence. A successful attack on Princeton would accomplish both objectives. Historical records from the Morristown National Historical Park indicate that Washington spent considerable time studying the geography around Princeton. The town sat at a crucial crossroads with roads leading to New York, Philadelphia, and the Delaware River. Whoever controlled Princeton could effectively control movement throughout central New Jersey. The British had recognized this strategic importance and had garrisoned the town with 3 regiments under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood. As the officers debated the merits of Washington's proposal, reports continued to arrive about Cornwallis's advance. The British commander was moving with uncharacteristic speed, clearly determined to bring the Americans to battle before they could escape across the Delaware again. By evening, advanced elements of the British force had reached the outskirts of Trenton, and the sound of distant cannon fire could be heard as the 2 armies' scouts clashed. Washington made his decision with the cool calculation that would mark his greatest military achievements. They would leave a small force in Trenton to keep their campfires burning and create the illusion that the main army remained in position. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Continental Army would execute a night march around Cornwallis's flank and strike Princeton at dawn. The plan required perfect timing and no small amount of luck. If Cornwallis discovered the ruse early, the Americans would be caught in the open and destroyed. If the night march bogged down in the frozen roads, they would arrive at Princeton too late to achieve surprise, and if the British garrison at Princeton proved too strong, the Continental Army might find itself trapped between the enemy forces with no line of retreat. As darkness fell on December 27th, Washington's men began their preparations for what would become one of the most audacious maneuvers in American military history. The night march that began in the early hours of December 30th would test every ounce of endurance the Continental Army possessed. Washington had divided his force into 2 columns, with General John Sullivan leading the main body along the river road, while General Nathanael Greene took a parallel route through the countryside. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a bitter wind cut through the soldiers' inadequate clothing as they began their silent advance. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, commanded the advance guard of cavalry that would screen the army's movement and provide early warning of any British patrols. The young officer understood that the success of the entire operation depended on maintaining absolute secrecy until they were in position to strike. A single encounter with enemy scouts could alert the Princeton garrison and ruin any chance of achieving surprise. The roads themselves presented a constant challenge. The freeze-thaw cycle of late December had left them covered with a treacherous coating of ice that made every step hazardous. Artillery pieces had to be manhandled over the worst sections, and the wheels of supply wagons frequently became locked in frozen ruts. The Army's progress slowed to a crawl as units bunched up behind obstacles, but Washington pressed them forward with quiet determination. Private Joseph White of the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment later wrote in his diary about the surreal quality of that night march. The landscape was bathed in pale moonlight that made every shadow appear to harbor enemy soldiers. The men moved like ghosts through the frozen countryside, communicating only in whispers and hand signals. Many soldiers wrapped their feet in rags to muffle the sound of their footsteps, leaving dark stains in the snow where their makeshift boots leaked blood. According to research conducted by the Princeton Battlefield Society, the Army covered nearly 12 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in New Jersey. They had to cross multiple streams where the ice was too thin to support artillery, requiring the guns to be dismantled and carried piece by piece. At several points, the column became so strung out that rear elements lost contact with the units ahead of them, forcing officers to ride back and forth along the line to maintain cohesion. As dawn approached on January 3, 1777, Washington's gamble appeared to be paying off. The Army had successfully circled around Cornwallis's position without detection, and advance scouts reported that Princeton appeared to be held by only a modest garrison. The British had clearly not expected an American attack from this direction, and their defensive preparations reflected their assumption that any threat would come from the south. But the general knew that time was now their enemy. Cornwallis would soon discover that the Continental Army had abandoned its positions at Trenton, and he would immediately begin searching for Washington's true location. If the British commander moved quickly enough, he could still trap the Americans. Against the Millstone River with nowhere to retreat, Washington deployed his forces with the precision of a chess master. executing a carefully planned combination. Sullivan's column would approach Princeton from the southwest, while Greene's men would circle around to attack from the northwest. The pincer movement would prevent the British garrison from concentrating its defense at any single point, and it would also provide multiple escape routes if the attack failed. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the frozen landscape, the Continental Army prepared to launch the assault. That would determine whether their Christmas victory at Trenton had been a fluke or the beginning of a genuine military renaissance. The soldiers checked their weapons one final time and whispered brief prayers before beginning their advance on the unsuspecting town. The British garrison at Princeton was just completing its morning roll call when the first American shot shattered the winter stillness. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, commanding the 17th Foot, had been preparing to march his regiment south to join Cornwallis when Captain William Washington's cavalry burst from the tree line and charged directly at his startled troops. The initial assault created chaos in the British ranks. Mawhood's men had expected to spend a peaceful morning on routine patrol duties, not to find themselves under attack by an enemy force that was supposed to be trapped at Trenton. The Redcoats scrambled to form defensive lines while their officers shouted contradictory orders and tried to determine the size and direction of the American assault. Captain Alexander Hamilton unlimbered his artillery battery on the high ground overlooking the town, and immediately opened fire on the British positions. His guns, served by crews who had learned their deadly craft during the retreat from New York, poured shot into the enemy formations with devastating accuracy. The young captain directed his fire with a mathematical precision that would later make him famous as a financial theorist, calculating angles and distances with the same intensity he would later apply to economic policy. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the American advance guard, led his men directly toward the heart of the British position with the aggressive tactics that had made him a legend on the frontier. The former Scottish physician had learned warfare in the harsh campaigns against Native American warriors, where hesitation meant death and audacity often carried the day. His Virginia riflemen moved through the streets of Princeton with the fluid coordination of hunters stalking dangerous prey. The battle quickly developed into a series of vicious close-quarter engagements as both sides fought for control of key buildings and intersections. The Nassau Hall of the College of New Jersey, today known as Princeton University, became a fortress as British soldiers barricaded themselves inside and fired from the windows at advancing Americans. Hamilton's artillery would later fire the shot that ended this resistance by putting a cannonball through the building's wall. Historical accounts preserved in the Princeton University archives describe the fierce hand-to-hand combat that raged throughout the town. Bayonets flashed in the morning light as soldiers grappled with each other in narrow alleyways and doorways. The crack of musket fire echoed off the brick buildings, while the acrid smoke of black powder created a fog that obscured vision and choked the combatants. General Mercer, leading from the front as always, was struck down by multiple bayonet wounds while rallying his men for a final charge against the British center. The loss of their beloved commander might have broken a less experienced force, but these Continental soldiers had been hardened by months of defeat and retreat. Instead of falling back, they pressed their attack with renewed fury, determined to avenge their fallen general. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, realizing that his position was hopeless, attempted to conduct a fighting withdrawal toward New Brunswick, where he could link up with other British forces. But Washington had anticipated this move and had positioned blocking forces along all the major escape routes. The British found themselves surrounded by an enemy that fought with the desperate courage of men who knew this might be their last chance to prove themselves. The climax of the battle came when Washington himself appeared on the battlefield, mounted on his white charger and seemingly oblivious to the musket balls whizzing around him. The general's presence electrified his men and struck fear into the hearts of the British soldiers, who had been told that the American commander was a coward who would only fight from a safe distance. Here was proof that their enemy possessed the same physical courage that had made British officers respected throughout Europe. As the morning sun climbed higher, the British resistance finally collapsed. Mawhood's remaining men threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than face annihilation. The Americans had achieved another stunning victory, but Washington knew that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Escaping before Cornwallis could bring his superior numbers to bear. The aftermath of the Princeton victory presented General Washington with both triumph and immediate peril. His ragged Continental Army had captured nearly 300 British prisoners, seized valuable military supplies, and demonstrated once again that American forces could defeat professional European troops in open battle. But even as his men celebrated their success, the general could hear the distant rumble of cannon fire from the south. Lord Cornwallis had discovered the American deception and was racing north with his entire army. Captain Rodney of the Delaware Regiment reported that British advance guards were already crossing the Assunpink Creek and would reach Princeton within hours. Washington faced a critical decision. Should he attempt to hold the town against Cornwallis's superior numbers, or should he withdraw with his prizes and preserve his army for future operations? The choice would determine not just the fate of his soldiers, but potentially the outcome of the entire revolutionary struggle. The general's strategic instincts told him that discretion was the better part of valor. His army had achieved far more than anyone had dared hope, striking the successful blows against British prestige in the space of 10 days. To risk everything in a pitched battle against overwhelming odds would be to gamble away all the gains they had made. Yet Washington also understood the psychological impact that another withdrawal might have on his men's morale and on public opinion throughout the colonies. Colonel John Cadwalader, whose Pennsylvania militia had fought with distinction during the street fighting, argued forcefully for a continued advance toward New Brunswick, where the British maintained their largest supply depot in New Jersey. The capture of such a prize would cripple enemy operations throughout the region and provide the Continental Army with desperately needed equipment and provisions. But other officers, including the cautious General Greene, counseled immediate retreat to the safety of the Watching Mountains. According to military correspondence housed at the New York Historical Society, Washington spent precious minutes studying his maps and consulting with local guides about possible escape routes. The general understood that conventional military wisdom dictated an immediate withdrawal, but he also recognized that this war would not be won through conventional tactics. Bold strokes that captured public imagination and demonstrated American capabilities were worth considerable risk. The decision, when it came, reflected Washington's growing confidence in his army's abilities and his understanding of the Revolutionary War's unique character. They would withdraw, but not in the panicked flight that had marked so many previous retreats. Instead, the Continental Army would conduct a deliberate retrograde movement that would preserve their gains, while positioning them for future operations. The withdrawal from Princeton became a masterpiece of military logistics and timing. Washington deployed his most reliable units as rear guards while the main army moved north with their prisoners and captured supplies. Artillery batteries were positioned at key choke points to delay any British pursuit, and cavalry patrols ranged far ahead to scout safe routes through the difficult terrain of central New Jersey. Private James McMichael of the Pennsylvania line later wrote that the retreat felt more like a victory parade than a withdrawal. The soldiers marched with their heads high, proud of what they had accomplished and confident in their ability to defeat any enemy they might encounter. The psychological transformation that had begun at Trenton was now complete. These men no longer saw themselves as defeated rebels fleeing from professional soldiers, but as a legitimate army capable of winning their nation's independence. As the Continental Army disappeared into the winter landscape of New Jersey, they left behind a British command structure that was beginning to question its fundamental assumptions about American military capabilities. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had demonstrated that colonial forces could execute complex operations, maintain discipline under fire, and adapt their tactics to local conditions with a flexibility that European armies often lacked. The reverberations of these 10 days would echo far beyond the frozen fields of New Jersey. The news of Princeton traveled across the Atlantic Ocean with the speed of 18th century communication, reaching European capitals through merchant ships and diplomatic pouches over the following months. In the gilded halls of Versailles, King Louis XVI received reports of the American victories with barely concealed satisfaction. France had been seeking an opportunity to strike back at Britain after their humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, and these unexpected colonial successes suggested that an alliance with the American rebels might actually prove worthwhile. The French Foreign Minister, Charles Gravier Comte de Vergennes, had been monitoring the American rebellion with professional interest since its inception. The early colonial defeats around New York had convinced many European observers that the revolution would collapse within months, making any investment in the American cause a foolish waste of resources. But Princeton changed that calculation entirely. Here was proof that colonial forces could not only survive British attacks, but could launch successful offensive operations of their own. In London, the news struck the North Ministry like a thunderbolt. Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State responsible for prosecuting the war in America, had assured Parliament that the rebellion was essentially over after the British victories around New York City, the capture of Philadelphia, and the destruction of Washington's army were supposed to be mere formalities that would conclude before spring. Now those assumptions lay in ruins, along with British prestige and parliamentary confidence in the government's strategy. King George III himself reportedly flew into one of his legendary rages. Upon hearing of Cornwallis's failure to destroy the Continental Army, the monarch had staked his personal reputation on crushing the American rebellion quickly and decisively. Every day that Washington's forces remained in the field was another day that other European powers could contemplate intervention, potentially transforming a colonial uprising into a global conflict that might threaten British dominance of world trade. Historical research conducted by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation reveals that the psychological impact of Princeton extended far beyond military and diplomatic circles. Throughout the 13 colonies, militia units that had been demoralized by previous defeats began reorganizing and preparing for renewed operations against British outposts. Local committees of correspondence spread accounts of the victories, often embellishing the details to maximize their propaganda value. The recruitment crisis that had plagued the Continental Army began to ease as young men who had previously been reluctant to join what seemed like a hopeless cause now saw service as potentially glorious rather than suicidal. Veterans of the Princeton campaign found themselves treated as heroes when they returned to their home communities, and their accounts of the battle inspired others to enlist. The army that had seemed on the verge of dissolution in December was now growing stronger with each passing week. Perhaps most importantly, the victory at Princeton convinced many wavering Americans that independence was actually achievable. The psychological barrier that had prevented many colonists from supporting the revolution, the belief that Britain was simply too powerful to defeat, had been shattered by these dramatic demonstrations of American military capability. Public opinion polls of the era, such as they were, showed a marked shift toward support for the Patriot cause. The British response to these setbacks revealed the fundamental strategic confusion that would plague their war effort for the next 6 years. Some officials argued for massive reinforcement of American garrisons to crush the rebellion through overwhelming force. Others proposed negotiated settlements that would grant colonial autonomy while preserving British sovereignty. Still others advocated abandoning the American colonies entirely and focusing British resources on more profitable imperial ventures in Asia and the Caribbean. This strategic uncertainty at the highest levels of British government would prove to be one of Washington's greatest advantages as the war continued. While his enemies debated grand strategy, the American commander could focus on the tactical and operational challenges of keeping his army in the field and striking at vulnerable British positions whenever opportunity arose. The winter encampment at Morristown that followed the Princeton campaign provided General Washington with time to reflect on the transformation his army had undergone. During those crucial 10 days of late December and early January, the Continental soldiers who had crossed the Delaware in defeat were not the same men who now constructed their winter quarters with the confidence of professional troops. They had discovered something precious and fragile, the knowledge that they could defeat the best soldiers Europe had to offer. This psychological transformation extended far beyond the immediate participants in the battles. Throughout the former colonies, ordinary citizens began to speak differently about their prospects for independence. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had provided concrete proof that American arms could prevail against British regulars, not through luck or surprise alone, but through superior tactics, better knowledge of local terrain, and most importantly, deeper commitment to their cause. Captain Alexander Hamilton, now serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, would later write that the Princeton campaign marked the moment when the Continental Army truly became a national institution, rather than a collection of colonial militias. The shared hardships of the winter march, the common danger of battle, and the collective pride in victory had forged bonds between men from different regions that would survive the war and help create the political foundation for the United States. The strategic implications of the campaign extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. British commanders throughout North America were forced to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about colonial military capabilities and the nature of the conflict they were fighting. The comfortable certainty that overwhelming British superiority would produce quick victory had been replaced by the disturbing realization that this war might continue for years. General Cornwallis himself, stung by his failure to trap Washington's army, would spend the remainder of the war seeking opportunities to redeem his reputation through decisive victory over the Americans. This personal obsession would eventually lead him to the disastrous campaign in the South that would culminate in his surrender at Yorktown. The seeds of that ultimate British defeat were planted in the frozen fields around Princeton. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress describe how news of the Princeton victory spread throughout Europe, influencing the calculations of potential allies and enemies alike. The Spanish court, always eager to weaken British power in North America, began providing covert assistance to American merchants and privateers. The Dutch, despite their official neutrality, allowed American agents to purchase weapons and supplies through their Caribbean colonies. Most significantly, the French decision to enter the war as an active American ally can be traced directly to the impact of Princeton and Trenton on European perceptions of colonial military capability. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American representative in Paris, would later note that no diplomatic argument he could make was as persuasive as the simple fact that American forces had twice defeated British regulars in open battle. The personal cost of these victories was measured not just in casualties, but in the transformation of the men who survived them. General Hugh Mercer's death at Princeton made him one of the war's first martyred heroes, and his sacrifice inspired a generation of American officers to emulate his aggressive leadership style. The Continental Army that emerged from winter quarters in spring 1777 bore his influence in its willingness to take risks and seize initiative. Perhaps most importantly, the Princeton campaign established the strategic template that would eventually win American independence. Washington had demonstrated that his army's greatest strength lay not in holding territory or fighting set-piece battles, but in maintaining mobility and striking at vulnerable enemy positions. When opportunity arose, this strategy of attrition and exhaustion would eventually convince Britain that the cost of holding the American colonies exceeded any possible benefit. As spring returned to New Jersey in 1777, the Continental Army prepared for another campaign season with confidence born of proven success. The 10 days that had begun with desperate hope and ended with stunning victory had transformed not just an army, but a nation's understanding of what was possible. The United States of America had been forged in the crucible of those frozen battles, and nothing would ever be the same again.